The sport of MMA is packed with excitement, but besides the actual fighting, a big part of it are the characters that create this beautiful world of martial arts, from people like GSP, Anderson Silva and Jose Aldo, to those of Conor McGregor, Ronda Rousey and Jon Jones. One thing about the fight business is certain. It can be wonderful and filled with opportunity, yet cruel and unforgiving to those who fall in the cold claws of its shadow. In this series we'll examine the unique characters that mixed martial arts has to offer us, their rise to fame and championship fights, and what happens when their success starts to decline. My name is Michael, and this is The Rise and Fall of Jon Jones.
Jon Bones Jones, the second coming of Jesus Christ.
Although Jones wasn't technically defeated in a fight, he has been stripped of his light heavyweight title twice, and that has to be some sort of a record. Jones's fall wasn't the typical one, for example of Ronda Rousey, being at the top, then losing saying it's because of not being focused, insulating herself and focusing only on training, and then losing again. Or the one of Johnny Hendricks, a bizarre combination of not taking responsibility and errors in judgment. Because see, Jones's career is not over, although he fucked up a lot and probably lost a lot of opportunities to make money and further his career, but because of his fighting abilities and him being a marketable guy, despite of his shortcomings, he's gaining a chance of fighting for the title once again at UFC 232 against Alexander Gustafsson. Because there's so much to Jon Jones' story, let me start with the day he became the UFC champion. On March 19, 2011 at UFC 128, Jones defeated the former Pride champion Shogun Rua and became the youngest UFC champion ever. Later that year at UFC 135, Jones would defend his belt and defeat Rampage Jackson via rear naked choke in the 4th round. UFC then tried booking a fight against his former teammate Rashad Evans for the second time, but because of Evans' notion and injury, Jones would face Lyoto Machida instead. Those two would share the octagon at UFC 140. During the fight, due to Machida's countering fighting style, Jones ran into a little bit of trouble, getting rocked early on but ultimately overcoming the stylistic challenges of the matchup, defending his title for the second time and at the same time showcasing his finishing abilities by choking out and dropping the unconscious fighter on the mat. Finally, after 3 attempts at fighting Rashad Evans, the fight is scheduled for April 21, 2012 at UFC 145. As those two were teammates before, the mental warfare leading up to the fight was something you would expect. But in all of that trash talk, Rashad Evans said something that now, in retrospect, stands out.
And I just say what I say about him being fake, because Jon is not the person that, he says he is or tries to pretend he is to be. He's setting himself up for a fall that I don't think he can take right now.
Nobody knew that Evans would predict the fall of Jon Jones, but since they were teammates before, maybe he knew something we didn't. Let's just take it as the foreshadowing of what happens next, the snowball effect that Jones's career takes on. At UFC 145, Jones would defeat Evans in an impressive fashion and defend his title once again. A month after his 3rd consecutive title defense, he got into trouble for the first time by crashing his Bentley into a pole. Jones was arrested for driving under the influence and pleaded guilty to DUI charges. He had his driving license suspended and ended up paying a $1,000 fine. As announced by Dana White, Jones's next opponent would be Dan Henderson. The fight was expected to take place at UFC 151, but Henderson pulled out of the bout due to suffering a knee injury. Jones then refused a late replacement fight with Chael Sonnen after his coach Greg Jackson told him it would be pretty difficult to prepare with just 8 days of training. That resulted in UFC cancelling their first pay-per-view event in the company's history. Here are some thoughts Dana White shared about the whole fiasco.
Now, I literally just bumped into Greg Jackson the other day, and I was kind of joking around about some of the things he said. I'll tell you what, I'll go on the record saying, this guy is a fucking sport killer. You know what? Good for you, Jon Jones. You're rich and you got some money. You don't need to take this fight. But there's a bunch of guys on the undercard that this is how they feed their family. And this is how they make a living. And the UFC has spent shitloads of money to promote this fight. And because you don't feel like it, or whatever your reason is that you don't fight, I can't make you fight, but it's probably not a good idea to not do it. I mean, this is one of those selfish, disgusting, decisions that doesn't just affect you. You just affected, 16 other people's lives, families, kids are going back to school. The list goes on of all the things, the money that was spent for these fighters to train and everything else.
After negotiations, the UFC and Jones's camp agreed to fight Vitor Belfort just 22 days later at UFC 152. During a pre-fight interview with Oriol Helwani, Jones commented on the issue. A quick reminder that at that time he was still trying to pull off the good boy persona.
I'm gonna say, Dana, I'm just gonna tell him that I forgive him, pretty much. I have a general intention of what I want to happen, and basically it's gonna be based around forgiveness. And, I'm not expecting him to apologize, but I'm moving forward, I'm moving forward, and Dana spoke his mind, and, ultimately he can't take back what happened. I can't take back what happened. I don't think he wants to, and I don't want to, so we're just gonna be men and keep this great journey that we have going. We're both ambassadors for the UFC, and that's not being on the same page. I said yesterday on Sports Center or whatnot. It makes no sense for us MMA fans, MMA Nation. So I want to do great things, and I think having him on my side or working with him and not being known as a troublemaker with him will be beneficial for both of us.
During the fight, despite almost being submitted via armbar in round 1, Jones successfully defended his title. Next, Jones would coach the season 17 of The Ultimate Fighter against a man that he refused to fight earlier, Chael Sonnen himself. The whole relationship between them could be summarized in this meme.
Get him. Oh, green Jimmy the cricket suit wearing ass motherfucker. Get him. Oh, short Colin Powell haircut having ass motherfucker. Get him. Little Angela Davis mustache wearing ass motherfucker. Get him. Little Richard Pryor shortcut fade having around the side wearing motherfucker. Gentlemen.
With Chael talking a lot but ultimately losing the fight pretty decisively. On September 21st, 2013 at UFC 165, Jones would take on Alexander Gustafsson at what turned out to be the fight of the year. Where Jones was taken down for the first time in his career, he also suffered a lot of damage, a swollen eye, a cut above it, and a busted lip. Gustafsson definitely gave Jones the toughest matchup of his career, and many people even thought that the Swede won the fight. Judges on the other hand scored the bout 48-47, 48-47 and 49-46, a unanimous decision in favor of Jon Jones. That fight would also be Jones's 6th title defense, resulting in him breaking the record for the most consecutive title defenses in the UFC's light heavyweight history. The next challenger for Jones would be the Brazilian prospect Glover Teixeira. After 3 attempts to finalize the bout between the light heavyweight champion and Teixeira, the fight was finally announced for UFC 172, in which Jon Jones showcased a brilliant execution of his game plan, taking away Teixeira's weapons and in the meantime using his to his full advantage, and landing 138 significant strikes, the most in any of his MMA fights. The aftermath of the bout was a little bit different. It tipped the scale, if you will. Dana White, the MMA media and fans criticized Jones for poking his opponents in the eyes during his fights, going way back to the day he became the champion. Jones's reaction to the criticism wasn't the best either.
Jones put his finger in his eye, the dirtiest fighter in MMA.
And this is where things get more interesting. This is where we start to see the real Jon Jones. From this point on, despite being successful inside of the cage, outside, Jones gets into a lot of controversies. The fight against what was thought to be Jones's most competent opponent, the former Olympian Daniel Cormier, was booked for UFC 178. During a promotional event for that pay-per-view, Jones and Cormier got into a scuffle during an on-stage stare-down. Daniel shoved Jones by his throat and Jones responded with a punch. He was later fined $50,000 and was ordered to undergo 40 hours of community service by the Nevada Athletic Commission. During the disciplinary hearing, Jones claimed losing a six-figure endorsement deal with Nike, but later admitted to fabricating the statement. The fight with DC had to be ultimately rescheduled due to Jones nursing an injury. It's January 3, 2015, UFC 182. Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier square off for the first time. The fight was competitive but not close. Jones ended up winning a 49-46 unanimous decision and taking down the former Olympian not only for the first time in his career but also doing it 3 times during the 25-minute fight. On January 6, 2015, it was announced that Jones failed a drug test prior to UFC 182. He tested positive for a cocaine metabolite. He was not suspended as that substance isn't banned out of competition by the World Anti-Doping Agency. When the situation was made public, Jones went into rehab for only 1 night, stating to the media that he's not a drug addict. He was fined $25,000 for violating the UFC's Athlete Code of Conduct policy. Also prior to UFC 182, Jones's testosterone to epitestosterone ratio was considered by some experts to be suspiciously low, indicating PED usage. On April 27, 2015, Jones ran a red light and crashed his rental car into a collision involving 2 other vehicles. He fled the scene of the crash, leaving an injured pregnant woman behind in another car. He was stripped of his light heavyweight title and was sentenced up to 18 months of supervised probation. Jones also lost his sponsorship with MuscleTech and Reebok just 5 months after acquiring the endorsement deal. During that time, a fight between Jon Jones and Anthony Johnson was supposed to take place at UFC 187, but because of Jon being a shithead and being under suspension, UFC sought replacement and finalized the pay-per-view card with a new light heavyweight championship on the line. Now Anthony Johnson would face the former title challenger Daniel Cormier. On May 23, 2015, at UFC 187, Daniel Cormier would defeat Johnson by rear naked choke, and the UFC had the new light heavyweight champion for the first time since 2011. A rematch between Daniel Cormier and Jon Jones was expected to take place on April 23, 2016 at UFC 197. However, DC pulled out of the fight suffering an injury just 3 weeks before the event and was replaced by Owen St. Preux. Jones went on to defeat OSP by unanimous decision and win the interim light heavyweight championship in a somewhat lackluster performance. DC commented on the fight, saying that this is the new Jon Jones. This is Jon Jones that likes to lift weights, who's a big guy that's cutting weight and can't rehydrate the old way under USADA rules. This is Jon Jones in the real world today, so when we fight in July, he's going to look the same. A rematch with Daniel Cormier was rescheduled for UFC 200. However, prior to the event, a urine sample from Jones tested positive for 2 banned substances and Jones had to withdraw from the event. Here's DC's reaction to hearing the news.
Jones tested positive.
Damn, come on. Come on.
I know, bro. Fuck, I'm so sorry.
Come on.
I know.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
So hard.
I know, I'm so fucking sorry.
Like, is there anything I can do? Like, I'll sign a release and we can just fight.
Can't do it.
Jones held a press conference to address the failed drug test.
I want to first start by apologizing to all the fans who came out to support me for UFC 200. Obviously, the UFC for Titos, for not being able to perform, and I know there's been a lot to go into this event. All the staff of the UFC, and Daniel Cormier. I want to apologize to Daniel Cormier. And, you know, I just wanted to tell them I'm sorry. That's really it.
The show has to go on, and DC would now face the former middleweight champion Anderson Silva and defeat him by decision. Later on, UFC stripped Jones of his interim light heavyweight title. Then USADA revealed the banned substances he tested positive for and issued a 1-year suspension for Jones after concluding that he did not take the banned substances intentionally. After Jones failed the UFC 200 drug test, a story about him avoiding USADA testing came out.
USADA rolls in to Jackson's gym to do a test on Jon Jones, and there was only some coaches in there, and there was like 5 people there at the time. So he can see them coming. Where they parked, he can see them coming. So they don't know what to do with him. They hide him underneath the cage. Jon Jones hides under the cage. They tell Jon, we don't know where he is. And this is before we were enrolled in the program, and he did not need to disclose his whereabouts. At the same time, if they show up and find you, you must vandalize this situation. You must test. They can't find you. You didn't have to test back then. So anyway, he hides under the ring. They say, well, where is he? He's supposed to, this is his gym. They say, well, how would I know where he is? So instead of leaving like they thought they would do, they take a seat. Well, there's like 8 hours left in the business day. They don't ever leave. However long with 6 or 8 hour time frame, Jon's under the cage the entire time. So people are coming and going. The whole thing is finally they shut the lights off and go to lock the doors. Now Jon can come out. Well, USADA found out about that. And they didn't do this. They wanted to get a warrant and go under that ring under the theory that at some point in that 6 to 8 hour span, he would have had to pee. Well, they wanted to go under forensically and collect that urine. That's how upset they were that they had been had.
The rematch between Jon Jones and now the new light heavyweight champion Daniel Cormier was a matter of time. Jones served his 1-year suspension and the fight was booked for July 29, 2017 at UFC 214. This part of his career was probably the craziest, and the rivalry with DC at its highest. The relationship between him and Jon Jones was comparable to a relationship between a superhero and a supervillain, with DC being the good guy and Jones the bad guy. All of Jones's controversies and drug test fails. You would think that in comparison to DC, the ultimate good guy, and considering how inspiring his story is, you would think that people would cheer and root for DC. But that wasn't the case. He was the one they disliked and booed the most. It was like Jones became a supervillain from a movie that people want to see succeed. Maybe it's because he won the first fight and DC became the champ because Jones wasn't there, or maybe it's because he shows that you don't have to be perfect to succeed, allowing people to live their own comeback story vicariously through him. I talk more about that in a video I made before DC's last fight called The Daniel Cormier the MMA's Superhero. I'll put a link in the description so that you can watch it. After months of training and weeks of trash talk, the fight night comes. Daniel Cormier and Jon Jones square off in what happened to be a much more competitive rematch than their first fight. Despite DC looking his best in recent history, Jones manages to TKO Cormier in the 3rd round, making himself the new light heavyweight champion. Jon Jones is now being celebrated. He failed many times, he struggled to show who he really is, but now he has completed his comeback story, and people love him for it. The happy ending didn't last very long. Just a month after his title win, it was announced that Jones was flagged for a potential doping violation by USADA. Jones was tested positive for turinabol, an anabolic steroid. The UFC 214 result was overturned to a no contest after both Jones's A and B samples tested positive as well. And now it was pretty clear that Jones is a walking example of not living up to your own potential. Jones was facing a potential 4-year suspension, but after giving USADA some valuable information about PED usage in MMA, he was only suspended for 15 months, and now will face Alexander Gustafsson at UFC 232 for the vacant UFC light heavyweight championship. There is no doubt in my mind that Jon Jones is the most talented fighter to ever fight in the UFC, but that's only one component to what it takes to be a world champion, besides not breaking the law or failing drug tests. Jon Jones's career will forever be talked about, regardless of focusing on his shortcomings or his accomplishments, regardless of him being a bad guy or a good example of a comeback story, regardless of either you being fond of him or just appreciate what he does inside of the cage. The case of Jon Jones will always amaze the spectator, and maybe that's the best part of it. It's never boring, there's always something to pay attention to. And maybe that's why people, or at least the UFC, is willing to give him another chance. It's because people will pay attention to it. And that's great for the UFC because attention makes money.
Dollar bills, y'all!
Thank you for watching the video. If you want to see more, hop on my channel and check out my other videos and subscribe.